Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Youth Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Zane Miller, and today we are here with another NYRA volunteer, Kelsey Duskie, and we're going to be talking about the issues that arise when young people can't get their identification because of, issues with their parents losing it or stuff like that. And we're going to be talking about the issues of young people and identification in general and the way that can pose problems for them in the future.
Hi, I'm Kelsey. I'm currently a university student. I'm studying English literature on the road to being a teacher, hopefully. And I guess my story is, it's not really like some big thing, but throughout my life, I have lost several documents, important documents, my social security card, my birth certificate, passports, general things you kind of need to identify yourself. Throughout my life, it was lost by my parents, several times. I've had several copies of my birth certificate had to get made, all that stuff. I never had access to any of my documents when I was growing up. Even when I got older, when I was 18, I asked for them, and then I found out they didn't exist anymore. And that led me to not be able to vote, not be able to get a proper bank account, not be able to pay rent, etc., etc. And due to that, I've come in contact with a lot of issues with trying to do just kind of basic things. Like when I was 16, I started working at a job, and I had my social security number, so I was able to get the job because I have the actual number, but I never had the card. And the only identification I've ever had is a passport and school IDs. So I was able to get the job, but I wasn't able to open bank accounts properly. So this depends on what banking system you're going with, but some of them require a lot more identification than others. When you're a minor, they require a little bit less. So I was able to eventually find a bank that would allow with just a passport and my social security number, which was Wood Forest. But other banks won't allow that. So that was the bank I was able to get a bank account with. But the problem with Wood Forest is it's kind of made for people who don't have identification, might have just gotten out of prison, things like that. So there's limitations to banking with them. They charge you a lot more money. They are not compatible with pretty much any banking service, like an online banking service besides Cash App. So in the digital age, there's a lot of transfer of money over online. And because of that, that's the only banking service I've been able to use. And still to this day, I still don't have documentation. And I've tried to get new ones because when I moved out, I had to pay rent. So the owner of the house used Zelle. I can't use Zelle because I obviously don't have a compatible banking service, and the only service that allows me with my limited documentation is Wood Forest. So those are kind of the problems you run into just in the financial aspect when you lose documentation. And it starts from there, but you run into a lot of issues when you lose documentation, especially when it's not your fault.
Yeah, and those are all really major issues. I mean, especially when it's not your fault, because when young people grow up, they're not given their documentation. I mean, unless you ask. I mean, some parents, they'll just give it to you if you ask. But most of the time, what happens is the government, they give your parents the birth certificate, the social security card, and then if you have a passport, it's usually in your parents' possession. You don't have a lot of those things, and a lot of the times it just stays with your parents up until you turn 18 or you're moving out and stuff like that. And that can be such a huge hassle, especially in issues where they get lost and stuff like that. But and the issue of replacing it too. Talk about the issues that you came across when you were trying to replace these documentations and what made it so difficult.
The thing about replacing your documents, it's a lot easier when you're under 18 and you have your parents there to prove who you are. But the thing is, for young people, when you go from 17 to 18, there's a big transition, right? And then you start needing a lot more documents to do a lot more solo activities that you might want to do now that you're an adult, now that you're on your own if you move out, things like that. So when you're faced with those kind of things, you need more documentation. And when you go to get more identification, like in Texas, there's like the Texas ID card, driver's license, things like that. You need these documents in order to get those. But the problem I faced was I was not able to get a driver's license because I did not have my social security card or birth certificate. So I was unable to do like basic driver's license things like enrolling in classes and stuff like that. And the goal was to get myself a social security card, but obviously I needed my parents for that, and my parents were unable to do that for a bunch of reasons. So I was faced with not having any of my documents. And then because of that, when I tried to go through the basic process of getting a license, I was unable to do that. And then once I turned 18, it's a different process, but you still need the same documents. So I was able to go through the adult driver's ed thing that's like required in Texas, is a 6-hour class. And I was able to do that. And then I needed to get my learner's permit so I could take the road test. But for getting your learner's permit, you need enough identification to prove that your social security number belongs to you and that you are who you are, say you are. So luckily for me, I had been working for 2 years at that point. So I didn't run into any issues with not being able to get that immediately once I was able to like drive there. Once I had like someone to drive me there, obviously. But for someone who wasn't working, if I had not been working or someone was in my shoes and they were not working, they would not have been able to get this document without getting a social security card, because you need a W-2 form usually, which has your social security number on it. But that's pretty much the only way to get it. I mean, there's a few other ways that are a little kind of roundabout and not that accessible now. It's like the most accessible way to prove your social security number if you don't have a card. But this is the problem I faced, is I couldn't get a new social security card because I couldn't drive. Couldn't drive because I didn't have a social security card. So it's kind of, you're stuck in this loop. And it happens to pretty much anyone else who has this problem. If you can't drive to get the social security card, then you can't get it. You have to go to the office. So you're kind of stuck in this spiral situation thing where you're just not able to get a solution. You're just stuck without these documents. And then it goes back to the financial aspect. You can't get certain bank accounts. You can't pay for certain things that require the new digital banking. There's a lot of issues that come across that. And then me personally, my father's a veteran, a disabled veteran, and children of disabled veterans or dependents of disabled veterans get a certain amount of money monthly to go to college. So to get my money, I had to log in online through, I think it's Real ID system. It's a new federal system to prove who you are and to be like confidential with your documents and all that. So I had to do that in order to fill out my Chapter 35 benefits form, which is the disabled veteran dependent benefits. So in order to do that, you go online and you have to log in through, I think it's actually called login.gov. You log in through login.gov, and in order to log in through login.gov, you need enough documents to prove who you are. One of the big documents to prove who you are is a social security card, which in my case, I had not had that. I just had a passport. And I was able to get a new copy of my birth certificate. So I had that too, but I didn't have enough to log in. So I was unable to prove who I was in order to get the benefits that my dad had earned from serving in the military and coming out injured. So due to that, I was struggling even more to pay for college and to pay for my rent, because that was money I was expecting. And I had been told to get all that I was going to get when I was growing up and all that stuff when I was planning for college. So it kind of goes back into anything with login.gov, you can't log into. And one of the only ways to get a social security card online, if you want to replace it, is through login.gov. So I had to go in person to get my social security card, which I still haven't done. I still don't have one. But anyone else facing it, if they can't drive, they can't go to the Social Security office. Or if they don't have someone to drive them, they can't go there. And they can't do it online because they don't have enough documents to prove who they are online. And it's an issue that any young person who had their parents in control of their documents and does not have access to them, turning 18 is going to face. And if you're under 18 and you're facing this issue and you want to get a driver's license, things like that, if your parents are restricting you from it or your parents are not willing to drive you there or to prove who you are, then you're not able to get it either. It can face anyone, really. But the thing is, from certain ages, it's completely out of your control. It was completely out of my control. And now it's starting to get back in my control, but I still have documents lost that I'm trying to get back. It's an issue of autonomy of documents and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And also about the aspect of like you kind of have to, even when you're 18 years old, and if your parents were in control of your documents and happen to lose them or whatever, even if you're 18, you still then kind of have to rely on them to be able to, prove who you are and stuff like that. So, luckily in your situation, you have like you're in good contact with your parents, you're in good relationship with them, not an issue there. But like, imagine a young person who the second they turned 18, let's say they had really oppressive parents, really strict parents, like really maybe even abusive parents. The second they turned 18, let's say they wanted to be done, like they wanted to be out of that situation. So they go no contact. They don't want to interact with their parents. But let's say their parents refuse to give them like their documentation or like their birth certificate, social security card, passport, any of that stuff. Then they don't have those things. And then they also can't rely on their parents to be able to supply them and help them with those things. So when you were going through the situation of getting your documentation back, what were the exact things that you needed to rely on your parents for to prove who you were? And if, let's say, hypothetically, you weren't in contact with your parents, how would that make it all the more difficult?
I've already listed the issues I face, but I'm thinking someone who doesn't have contact with their parents, they wouldn't have been able to get a driver's license unless their parents were willing to supply them with the documentation to get that prior. But they wouldn't be able to get a driver's license. They wouldn't be able to open most bank accounts or really any bank account if they have no documentation that's been supplied to them. I mean, the school ID might get you there might be like one or two, but not many. So you're pretty much unable to have like online money, which is the way of the world. And if you don't live in like a very urban city, you're not going to be able to travel that well. Like, besides like very urban cities, driving is necessary. Like, a social security office is not walkable for most people. That's usually, for me, it's a 45-minute drive. I mean, it's far from where I live. But I'm thinking then, Uber's an option now, but if you don't have money, if you don't have online money, you can't pay an Uber in cash. And if you don't live in a city, there's not taxis that you can pay in cash. So you're pretty much stuck wherever you are, unable to get documentation because you can't do it online, because online requires documentation to get documentation, which is kind of crazy. So you're stuck. You would be stuck without any documentation, without financial autonomy, without physical autonomy, unless you're willing to walk out like 4 hours each day to get places, unless you're living again in like NYC.
Yeah.
Because even in like, I live in Houston. If you live in the city of Houston isn't walkable. Like the inner city, it's not. There's not a walkable social security office. There's not a walkable DMV. All these offices are very far away and secluded usually for majority of Americans. So you're unable to get any autonomy with your physically, like to move, financial, and you're unable to get your documents pretty much. You'd be stuck. Most jobs are requiring more ID now, so
yeah,
it's you probably would not be able to, you would be completely reliant on your parents. And if they were abusive, that's a really tricky situation.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And also I like what you mentioned about like the freedom of movement aspect, about how you wouldn't be able to like just get from place to place. And you mentioned Uber, which is interesting because, young people in general a lot of times don't have freedom of movement. And Uber is one of those things because Uber has now been implementing ID verification. This happened to me when I was trying to use Uber as a minor to literally escape abusive situations in my life. They made it to where if your account gets reported as like suspicious or something, you then have to verify your ID to be able to use Uber. So, like, if you don't have documentation, you couldn't even use Uber to get from place to place. Like, let's say let's say you're not in contact with your parents, so you don't have someone that could just give you an easy ride to the social security office or whatever. So you're like, okay, and then you don't have a city with robust public transportation, like you're not like New York City or something. So you're like, okay, well then now I'll use Uber. Let's say you somehow have online money to be able to pay for it. Then they make you verify your ID to be able to even use Uber. So then you couldn't even use Uber. So then now you even have less freedom of movement and then less ways to fix the situation that was caused by something completely out of your control.
100%. And I like that you mentioned age verification, ID verification. Pretty much all banking apps have ID verification now. So I still am unable to use any banking app. Even Cash App, the one that is compatible with the only bank I was able to get with my limited identification, I can't prove my identity to them because I don't have the right identification to prove that.
Yeah.
So I have no form of online money really, which is a rising issue right now. So anyone without identification won't have access to online money, which is a large component of how we spend money and share money back and forth. And any type of movement like Uber, Lyft, anything like that requires to have some sort of online money. You can't pay with that with cash.
Yeah.
So you're stuck. And most jobs don't pay in cash unless they're kind of sketchy. So, or it's like a freelance job. So you're getting checks that you can't cash because you can't have a bank account. You've lost pretty much all autonomy from someone else's choice.
And back to the ID verification element, I feel like in general, young people, and especially minors, especially younger minors, are discriminated against with like ID verification elements. Like, let's say social media platform Discord, for example. Discord's rule for age is anyone 13 plus is allowed to be on the platform, which I would say younger people should be allowed, but that's a whole other thing. On terms of service, people 13 plus are allowed on the platform. But to verify, sometimes they make it to where you have to verify your age if, listen, your account gets suspected of being underage. And, I have an example of this. One of my friends who was 16 years old, he didn't have like a learner's permit. He didn't have like an ID. He didn't have a driver's license. He was 16 years old. Old enough to be on Discord, with terms of service. He made a joke in a server that was obviously a joke about saying, oh, I'm 12, when everyone in the server obviously knew it was 16. Random person came in there, reported that, then Discord said, oh, your account is underage. You have to then verify your ID to get your account back. Which, that in and of itself is very discriminatory against younger minors, because if you're 13, 14, 15, you're allowed to be on Discord and you're not breaking any rules. But if your account got reported for like being underage or whatever, you then have to verify your ID. But if you're 13, 14, 15, you don't have an ID. Most of the time people don't get like a learner's permit or something. I think the earliest you can get like a learner's permit would be like 15 and a half or something. And then, driver's license by like 16. But, a lot of the times people don't even do that. I didn't get my driver's license till I was like 16 and a half. You couldn't even get yours until you were 18. So a lot of young people, even if they are above the age of being able to have an ID, they still don't have one. So they don't have that ability to like verify their identity, even though they should be able to. They are old enough to be able to have access to these things, but they just can't verify. They can't prove it. So I feel like, asking this ID verification stuff by these platforms, that is in and of itself discriminatory against minors and especially younger minors.
Right, and especially since even if they were to have an ID, besides a driver's license, most platforms are not compatible with like checking other IDs.
Mm-hmm.
They say they do, but they really are only equipped to check a driver's license for verification because that's how their like coding is set up.
Yeah.
So young people are are the group that are not likely to have a license.
Yeah.
Even if they're above the age of 16, sometimes they still don't have a license. Sometimes they have to wait till 18 to get a license because their parents won't let them get a license.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're completely dependent on their parents for driver's ed and all that stuff. So any minor is getting discriminated against with this because that's the group that is most likely to not have a driver's license, even if they are of age for a platform. It's incredibly discriminatory.
For sure. And this, and it makes me think that I feel like a lot of the times minors are so incredibly dependent on their parents for these things. And I feel like that is a system that needs to change. And I feel like there should be other ways for young people to be able to get these forms of identification without having to rely on their parents or without having to rely on these overly complicated government systems. And I'm not entirely sure how they would be able to do that, but I think one of the ways off the top of my head, and I want your opinion on this too when I describe it, but think about it like this, like, a lot of schools, like when a parent enrolls a kid in a public school, they give them basically all of the information that would be needed for that to occur. And then the schools automatically have all that information. So I feel like, in my opinion, there would be no issue with like a minor going to a school and just being like, hey, can I have all of this information so can you just like get me an identification? Like, I feel like schools should be able to supply identification to like minors. And I feel like there should be more ways to identify yourself if you're under 18 or if you're under 16 or whatever. Because like, what type of identification do people that are like 13 and 14 have? Like, they don't have any of that. Like, they can't get any of those things. So then they wouldn't be able to verify their identity, like I said, for like certain social media platforms. I feel like schools should also be allowed to supply young people with other means of identification. Like, you should just be able to go to a school and just be like, hey, can I get like a social security card? And since schools are run by at least public schools are, run by the government, that should be just a thing that's part of public schools. Like, because that, like, schools would really be the only way that young people would be able to do this without their parents. Like, I feel like they would have to rely on their parents for everything else. But if they're at a school, the school already knows all their information, and that could be something they could just do easily. I'm not entirely sure. There's probably a lot of logistical things with that, but I feel like that would be one way, like in theory, for young people to be able to get more forms of identification without having to rely on their parents.
Yeah, I definitely think that would be a good idea. I don't know how plausible that would be necessarily. I don't know if that's something that could actually happen.
Yeah.
But that would definitely make so many kids' lives so much easier. But I think a more simple solution might be just giving more power to a school ID.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to a certified institution of education, like any kind, it doesn't have to be a public school, but if you go to a school, a private school, a charter school, anything like that, you should be able to use that ID if you're under 18, or even if you are enrolled in that institution, you should be able to use that ID as at least something to get you government ID.
Mm-hmm.
At least something at the Social Security office to use, at the DMV to use.
A lot of the times they need multiple. A lot of the times it's like you need this piece of ID plus this other piece of ID. So that makes it even more difficult if like you're missing one. It'll be like, oh yeah, you need your Social Security card plus your birth certificate to do this thing. And then it's like, okay, well, if you're missing one, then you should be able to use other things like a school ID. But a lot of the times they don't let that happen.
I think a school ID should have more power, and then I almost am tempted to say there should be some kind of deal with the Social Security number, that schools have a little more access to giving you like proper identification from it, but like almost something similar to a Social Security card that they could provide. Maybe that would be it's an interesting idea to explore, but this does lead me on the path of thinking, what about children who are homeschooled?
Mm-hmm.
And they're in an oppressive situation in that way?
Yeah.
They have no access to any identification, because a school ID can at least get you somewhere. But if you're homeschooled, you don't have a school ID, and if your parents are unwilling to give you your identification and you are homeschooled, then you have access to no ID.
Yeah.
No, nothing. You are completely isolated and you have lost all autonomy.
Yeah, for sure. And going back to what you said about making the school ID more powerful, there's actually been certain ways that like school IDs have actually been limited. Like specifically, like I know in Texas, I remember my government teacher actually in high school bringing this up. In Texas there was to be you need like a photo ID to be able to vote. But then they passed a law to make it to where the school ID, like the college ID, that's no longer valid. Like you can't use your college photo ID to be able to vote. But the gun ID is still valid, which is really interesting because I feel like that's kind of discriminatory because obviously the young people in general are going to have school IDs. So I feel like making it to where you take one piece of identification and saying, okay, this is no longer valid to vote. You have to go get something else. I feel like that's kind of, I wouldn't say voter suppression because it's not like directly suppressing voters because it's not saying you're not allowed to vote if you're, a college student, but it's making it difficult. It's making it more difficult for young people to be able to vote. And it's like directly discriminatorily targeting them.
It's definitely voter discrimination. I mean, because you're eliminating a main source of identification that these people are going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And we're, especially by having all identification controlled by your parents, I know there's not really the easiest solution for that, but when all identification is controlled by your parents, if your parents are unwilling to give it to you, then there's a group of people who do not have access to vote. And that's something that we are supposedly, like, it's our right to vote. It's given to us in the Constitution, but there's a group of people that pretty much under age 25 that are more likely to not be able to vote simply because of system, like, identification.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to be able to vote because they don't have proof of who they are, but that's completely and utterly, like, out of their control if they don't have that identification. Because I'm like one of the people who's in this situation who's, like, very lucky. My parents are not a problem. They've been trying to help me through this, even though they're the ones who lost it. They've been trying to fix it and they've been helping me through the process. But most people in this situation are not having parents that are helping them get more identification.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to oppress their children. They're trying to prevent them. But knowing that that is a possibility that can happen, it's probably more frequently happening than is ever talked about.
Mm-hmm.
You don't hear about it, but it's something that can easily happen.
Yeah.
Since that's happening, there's probably from 18 to 25, those are the people that are most impacted from it. The whole group of people that are not able to vote, who are not able to represent themselves in our government. That means we are gearing our voting system towards older generations,
Mm-hmm.
inherently discriminating against young people, and also just the development of our country. We're trying to keep it in the hands of the people who already have power.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting system because a lot of the things that we see with discrimination against the youth and, like, young people in general is it all can be tied back to this is limiting their ability to vote correctly.
Mm-hmm.
When we see book bans, it's limiting their ability to educate themselves and to know what they're voting on. You're trying to keep their minds in one box of what they want to be heard. And then, therefore, they don't know everything that's available. They don't have the ability to educate themselves properly before they vote, inherently limiting proper representation for this group of people. So 18 from 25 voters are not properly able to represent themselves because of many systems we have in the United States currently.
Yeah, for sure. And, along with that, I like what you mentioned about, people who would be in these oppressive home situations, because there's a lot of stories that I've heard about this. For example, I interviewed someone a while back who talked about she was dealing with a very oppressive parent and she was trying to leave at one point. She was over 18, but she was still relying on her parent for a lot of things, and she was trying to get out of the situation. She was kind of basically forced to being relying on her parent because her parent wouldn't give her really any autonomy, but she was trying to get out. She was trying to leave, and at one point, she tried to get her passport, and her mom wouldn't let her. Her mom literally physically tried to stop her from getting her passport, and she wasn't able to get her passport because of it. And it's like, there's instances where that can happen. And, the issue with that is obviously, I think I'm pretty sure that would be considered a crime, if the person's over 18. But the thing is, the issue here is by giving parents default control over these things and making it incredibly difficult for young people to then get new versions of these things without relying on their parents, it really forces them in that situation where they're forced to rely on their parents, which makes it incredibly difficult. And there's some instances in the past that I've heard about. There's instances where parents like stole their kids' identity and like ruined their credit score. Because there were certain things that all you need is a social security number to be able to like get certain aspects of credit, like certain credit cards and stuff. I think like back in the day, this was a lot easier to do with less identification as well. They would like steal their kid would be like an infant. They'd use their kid's social security number to like apply for certain things. They'd ruin their kid's credit. By the time their kid turns 18 and then is trying to build credit on their own, they physically can't because their parents ruined their credit score for them. I know this has been a story. I can throw an instance up on screen of like a news story about this, but I know that's been a thing that's happened. And that's scary to think about that, because parents have access to all of these things, it kind of gives them this power and this control over young people's lives in a way that I would say they probably shouldn't have that much, like this like kind of monopoly, I guess, on this identifying information.
I think it's interesting that you say that too, because it is, I imagine, it is obviously a crime to steal someone's identity, but I imagine it's a crime for parents to withhold identification from over 18 children. But if you don't have identification, you need identification to file a report with the police, generally in most states. How can you file a police report without identification about your identification being stolen? Our system has these cycles set up for people who have had their identification stolen or lost or whatever, or withheld from them, that they're stuck in, they've lost all autonomy just because someone else is withholding their identification.
Mm-hmm. And I like we mentioned about the police too, because like we mentioned in some states, in some areas, you need a photo ID to be able to even make a police report. But like also, a lot of the times when police like come after you for any reason, what's the first thing they're going to be asking for? They're going to be asking for identification. Police could come at you for any reason. There's been instances where police go at people, especially when they racially profile people. They'll be like going at people for anything. There's like I saw a video where a guy, an African American gentleman, was just like outside picking up like trash for his college, and he was like just picking up trash with like the trash tongs. Don't know the name for it, but they were like, oh yeah, and they like came at him and they were like, hey, we think you're trespassing, identify yourself. And like they wanted him to like identify himself with like identification or something, like show him like an ID or something to prove that he like belonged there or something. So yeah, that's just instances that police will come at people, like even if they're not pulling them over, because if people didn't have a driver's license they couldn't be driving, but like even if someone's like walking, even if someone's like doing something and they do something that could maybe be wrong in the eyes of a police officer, first thing they're going to be doing is being told to identify themselves. And they obviously could like show like their name, they can give them like their name or anything, but if they don't have like an actual form of identification, what do you think the first thing the police is going to think? They're going to be like, okay, this person's suspicious. Okay, they may have given me a fake name. Okay, they may have they're hiding something from me. That's the first thing they're going to think. But like, if someone is in a situation where they literally don't have these forms of identification because it's being withheld from them, it's like, that's out of their control. So now they're in a situation where they're being seen by police officers as you're more suspicious, when it's completely out of their control of why they even ended up in that situation in the first place.
It's a systematic issue too, because it goes in hand with systematic racism. And I know maybe we're not the right people to speak on this, but if you're thinking about the people who get profiled by the police, or right now in the age of ICE, the young black men and young Hispanic men are going to be the most profiled by these group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not to get into any issues with ICE right now. That's a whole separate topic. But someone who does have documentation, but they don't have access to it, and it's not their fault at all, has nothing to do with them, they could be detained. It's a really serious, in this day and age, it's a really serious issue, and it's someone who shouldn't be affected. It's due to parental oppression.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really bad systematic fault that we have currently in our government.
Yeah, because like especially with ICE and stuff like that. I mean, I've seen videos of like ICE picking up like teenagers, like people 17, 16. Like, what's the first thing ICE is gonna do? They're gonna try to get them to identify themselves. Oh yeah, show me your ID, show me this, show me that, show me like your papers, or whatever. If they don't have an ID genuinely just because, their parent has like their like let's say they didn't get the driver's license yet. Their parent may still have their birth certificate, the social security card. And if they're not with their parent, if they're just like out with friends, they can't identify themselves. So what's the first thing ICE is going to think? Oh yeah, this person's probably illegal. Let's throw them in the van. Like that's a
Right?
real concern.
And since we're thinking like anyone under 25 that's the group unlikely to have a driver's license, and that's the identification most people keep on them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I don't keep identification beside, like, now that I have a driver's license, I keep that on me, but I didn't walk around with my passport book. That's like a bulky thing.
Yeah.
You can't just keep that in your pocket. You can't keep it in your wallet. I walked, and luckily I'm not the group, I am not the demographic that is going to have an issue with that. But people who are, that they could get wrongfully detained, they could face so many issues. They could be put in jail, they could be put in detention centers, all these abuses done on them simply because they are not of age to have these identifications that we're talking about, or their parents won't give it to them, or it's just not something you carry around like a driver's license.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a driver's license for whatever. They didn't complete driver's ed yet. They couldn't afford driver's ed.
Mm-hmm.
You have to pay money to get a driver's license, and that's the most common identification that people want. If you're not carrying around an ID, because most people don't carry around an ID besides a driver's license, and all IDs besides your social security card cost money to get, you don't have access to money because you can't have a bank account because you don't have identification. How are you supposed to get identification? And then it causes all these wrongful like crimes committed against people.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, going back to what I said about, how Texas made it to where the college ID, like the school ID, didn't count for voting. That's interesting because when you think about it, like, what is the group of like the demographic of young people, specifically the demographic of young people most likely to not have a driver's license? It's probably young college kids that just got to college. They're living on campus to where they don't need to be driving. They can just be walking in between like campus and like the stuff nearby when they're living in like more like college towns that are a bit more walkable. So they don't need a driver's license. So their main form of identification is going to be that college ID, right? So then if they make it to where the college ID isn't valid to vote, so then you have to go pay money to get a driver's license. And if you're a college kid, you're probably broke. Like, it's like, that's just how it is. So then they're making it to where the ID specifically for young people, and not just for young people, specifically for young people that are less likely to have a driver's license, that ID is no longer valid. So then kind of targeting that group and making it to where it's harder for them to vote, making it to where they have to pay money to be able to get the identification necessary to vote.
And it's interesting because when you think about it, that's going to be the most educated group of young people,
Mm-hmm.
most educated on their rights and what they want to vote for. It's silencing the voices that are not corrupt by what they want you to vote for,
Mm-hmm.
what the big money man wants you to vote for.
Yeah.
So it's a systematic, it goes back to the systematic oppression idea that they're trying to systematically oppress these educated groups of young people from voting, or keep them systematically oppressed so they cannot get education, so they cannot vote for and represent themselves properly.
Mm-hmm.
It's keeping it so our laws are geared towards the older generation, not to a bunch of over 18 people who are able to vote, that should be able to vote by all means, but cannot vote for whatever reasons are systematically oppressing them.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
I do definitely feel like it's incredibly targeted. I mean, I just feel like it's so difficult for someone who's in this system of like, your parents either lose their identification or they withheld it from you purposefully. Like even contacting the government at a lot of times needs like setting up an appointment with government agencies. A lot of times that would need identification. So it's literally just this cycle of making it so difficult for these people to be able to do things. And, especially if they lack freedom of movement, especially if they don't have people to drive them places, especially, if they don't have online money to be able to pay for other modes of transportation. It really is a bad cycle. And, especially when it goes back to that voter suppression, the profiling of, police needing identification for certain things. And And it really is just a very bad system. But, I think we've talked about this for a while. I think we can go ahead and wrap up pretty soon. Is there any like last thoughts that you want to give on this or?
I think we've really said it all. It really does hint at a greater system fault, though, I think.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, thank you for coming on. Thank you for telling your
Of
story.
course.
And I really do hope that at some point this is going to be recognized more, and at some point they're going to make it easier for young people specifically to be able to get these forms of identification without having to rely on their parents so heavily, especially in instances where the parents, just don't have their best interests at hearts. But yeah, thank you everybody for listening in, and we'll see y'all in the next episode.
See y'all.
Bye-bye.